The bodies of dead children were being collected across 3 continents, and no one told their parents why. Between 1953 and 1969, the United States Atomic Energy Commission ran a classified program with a deceptively gentle name, Project Sunshine. Its purpose was anything but gentle. Scientists needed to understand how radioactive fallout from nuclear weapons testing was accumulating in human tissue. And they needed young tissue specifically because children's bones absorb strontium-90 more readily than adults, so they took them. From hospitals, from morgues, from funeral homes, more than 1,500 bodies in total, harvested for science without a single consent form signed. The program represented something larger than a single ethical failure. It revealed how Cold War anxiety could transform children's remains into strategic resources, how grief could be exploited in the name of national security, and how secrecy could shield actions that would have sparked outrage had they been known. But the full scope of what happened wouldn't emerge for decades, and when it did, the revelations would force governments on both sides of the Atlantic to confront what had been done in their names. The atomic age announced itself over Hiroshima in August 1945. Within a decade, the skies had absorbed more than 200 nuclear detonations from American, Soviet, and British tests. Each explosion punched radioactive material into the atmosphere, where it mixed with winds and weather, eventually settling onto farms and cities thousands of miles from any blast zone. Scientists called it global fallout. Strontium-90 was the particular concern. This isotope mimics calcium chemically, meaning the human body absorbs it into bones and teeth. Once lodged there, it irradiates surrounding tissue for years. The half-life of strontium-90 is 29 years. Children, with their rapidly growing skeletons, were especially vulnerable. Their bones were pulling in calcium constantly, and with it, any strontium-90 present in their milk, their water, their food. By 1953, the Atomic Energy Commission needed data. How much fallout was actually accumulating in Americans? How much could a human body tolerate? There was only one way to find out. They needed bones. Specifically, they needed bones from the young. Dr. Willard Libby, who would later win the Nobel Prize for developing radiocarbon dating, was one of Project Sunshine's architects. In a classified 1955 meeting, he acknowledged the program's fundamental problem with characteristic bluntness. Acquiring enough human samples was difficult. The Commission needed a constant supply of young remains, and they needed them quietly. The solution was a network that stretched across hospitals, universities, and research institutions in the United States, United Kingdom, Australia, and elsewhere. Medical professionals were recruited to collect tissue samples from deceased infants and children. Some removed entire limbs. Others took vertebrae, ribs, or femurs. In certain documented cases, bodies were stripped of all usable tissue before burial. Parents were not consulted. Mothers and fathers who had just lost children handed over bodies for burial, unaware that those bodies would arrive at cemeteries incomplete. The samples were shipped to laboratories where researchers measured their strontium-90 content, building a dataset that would inform radiation exposure standards for decades. The science was valuable. The methods were unconscionable. Project Sunshine was not exclusively American. British scientists participated enthusiastically, collecting samples from hospitals across England, Wales, and Scotland. The United Kingdom Atomic Energy Authority worked in parallel with its American counterpart, driven by the same Cold War imperatives and operating under similar secrecy. Documents declassified in the 1990s revealed the scale of British involvement. Hospitals in London, Manchester, Birmingham, and dozens of smaller cities contributed samples. One internal memo noted that researchers had obtained tissue from stillborn babies weighing as little as 3 pounds. Another recorded the collection of material from over 600 British children over a 15-year period. The British public would not learn of this until 2001, when a government inquiry investigated the unauthorized retention of children's organs at Alderhay Hospital in Liverpool. That scandal led journalists and investigators backward through decades of records, eventually uncovering Project Sunshine's British dimension. By then, many of the parents affected had themselves died, never knowing what had been done to their children's remains. Jean Pritchard buried her daughter in Sydney, Australia, in 1957. The baby had lived only a few days. Nearly 4 decades later, Prichard learned that her daughter's legs had been removed before burial and shipped to the United States for strontium-90 analysis. Her experience was not unique. Across Australia, Britain, and America, families eventually discovered that their children had been buried incomplete. Some learned through government inquiries. Others pieced together the truth from declassified documents released under Freedom of Information requests. Many never found out at all. The consent procedures of mid-century medicine were already minimal by today's standards, but Project Sunshine went further, deliberately avoiding any disclosure that might provoke refusal. Scientists understood that parents would object. They collected the samples anyway. In doing so, they transformed grieving families into unwitting participants in nuclear research, their children's bodies rendered down to data points in classified reports. Project Sunshine remained classified for reasons that had nothing to do with national security in any traditional sense. The program's secrecy protected the Atomic Energy Commission from public relations consequences, not from Soviet spies. Internal documents made this calculus explicit. Officials worried about newspaper headlines. They feared congressional scrutiny. They understood that Americans would react poorly to learning that their government was collecting children's bones without permission, so they kept it quiet. Classification stamps served as insurance against accountability. When nuclear testing moved underground after the 1963 Limited Test Ban Treaty, the immediate need for fallout data diminished. Project Sunshine wound down gradually through the late 1960s. The samples it had collected were analyzed, catalogued, and eventually archived. The parents who had provided them unknowingly returned to their lives, their grief processed, their losses mourned. The full truth remained buried in government warehouses for another 30 years. The documents began surfacing in the 1980s and 1990s, pried loose by journalists, researchers, and activists using new Freedom of Information laws. What they revealed provoked outrage that transcended national boundaries. Congressional hearings were held, British inquiries were convened, apologies were issued. In 1994, Energy Secretary Hazel O'Leary ordered the declassification of documents related to Cold War radiation experiments. Project Sunshine was among the programs exposed. The Clinton administration established the Advisory Committee on Human Radiation Experiments, which investigated numerous Cold War programs that had used human subjects without consent. Their 1995 report condemned the ethical failures of the era while acknowledging the difficulty of applying modern standards retroactively. But for many families, the revelations came too late. Parents who might have demanded answers had already died. The scientists who ran the program were elderly or gone. The institutions involved had restructured, renamed themselves, moved on. Justice, in any meaningful sense, was no longer possible. What remains is memory, and the questions memory carries. Project Sunshine collected over 1,500 samples from children who died of leukemia, stillbirth, accidents, and disease. Each sample represented a family shattered, a small coffin lowered into the ground. The parents who stood at those gravesides believed they were burying their children whole. They were wrong. The program's defenders argue that the data gathered saved lives, informing radiation safety standards that protected millions. Perhaps this is true. The science was real, and the Cold War fears that motivated it were not irrational. Atmospheric nuclear testing did contaminate the environment. Understanding that contamination was genuinely important, but the ends do not justify the means. The families of Project Sunshine subjects were not asked to sacrifice their children's remains for the greater good. That choice was taken from them by scientists who decided, in classified meetings and internal memoranda, that public knowledge would be inconvenient. That grief could be managed. That silence was preferable to consent. The children's bones eventually told their story, their strontium-90 content measured and recorded in scientific papers. Decades later, the documents told another story, one of secrecy and exploitation of institutions that placed their own interests above the dignity of the dead. That second story belongs to history now. It belongs to us, the living, who must decide what lessons it carries forward, what trust it demands we rebuild, and what graves we must finally, properly fill.